Hi, my name is Chris Meyer. I'm a family law attorney here in the greater Houston area. Today I am walking through Sugar Land Memorial Park. I found this really wonderful trail. I want you to take a look at it. It's really nice. A lot of fresh air, a lot of sunlight. It's really good. What's the thing that I have in common with all these plants here is I'm very much like these plants. I need a lot of sunlight to be successful, and that's why I come here to think about my clients, how I can help them, and to clear my head, find mindfulness, if you will. Okay, so today I would like to talk about the 10 types of abusers, the 10 faces of an abuser. And of all these different types of abusers, or all these different faces of an abuser, what is the one thing that they all have in common? And I'm going to go over the 10 different faces of an abuser. And it is possible maybe an abuser is only shows one of these faces, but it's also possible they might show all 10. I mean, I've seen it all. I've seen abusers really go after the victim hard. It's very inappropriate. It's very harassing and can be very physically violent. Very emotional for the victim. But I've also seen, after I shut these abusers down, and by the way, I don't represent abusers, I only help victims. But sometimes these abusers, after I shut them down, at that point their only remedy to harass the victim is through the legal system. So that is one way to harass a victim. So using the legal process or filing frivolous lawsuits, unfortunately, within certain, I guess you want to say, parameters, depending on how it's presented, it could be considered harassing, and it could be a violation of another protective order. But at the same time, would be, I guess, there's also an argument that it might be unconstitutional to not let someone exercise what legal remedies they do legally have available to them. So it's kind of a fine line there. And unfortunately, I have victims who are being sued with frivolous lawsuits. It's extremely frustrating, extremely sad. And I do what I can to keep the abusers away. That's not a problem. So I'm not really going to go into that specific face of an abuser, the abusing the legal process, but I am going to go into the other types. Okay, first I want to talk about violence, the physical violence, the sexual violence. The thing about the physical violence and sexual violence is it's more objective. It's a little bit easier to prove. If a victim comes to me with photographs of bruises or markings around the neck, like usually it's cell phone pictures, or maybe cuts and scrapes, or they were bleeding and they took a picture of it, that type of physical violence is easier to prove because I have a photograph taken by the victim themselves, because we all have these cell phones nowadays. And it's not too difficult for me to get the evidence into the courtroom, because the victim, 95% of the time, they were the photographer. They were the ones who took a picture of the bruises, the blood, the markings around the neck, other parts of the body. So that, or maybe the victim's property was smashed, and they were able to get me a picture of that. And because the victim was the photographer, based on, without getting into a technical argument on the Texas rules of evidence, it's easier for me to get those photographs or digital images into court as evidence. It's called, authenticating the evidence, but we're not going to go into that for purposes of this video. That's my job, to figure out how to get the evidence in. So I'm not worried about that, but I am saying that physical violence is, because usually requires like a physical touching or some type of offensive touching of the victim, and that can be testified to or proven through photographs. I'm not really going to go too deep into that for purposes of this video, because if something physical happened and you got the evidence, you can call 911, or hell, even if you don't have the evidence, you can still call 911 if you're unsafe. But if the police department isn't going to help you get a protective order, sometimes the victim might need to go to AVDA, Advocates for Victims of Domestic Abuse. But AVDA also has their own restrictions, and unfortunately they're very busy and backed up. So sometimes these victims are forced to go to private family law attorneys like me and come talk to me, and I'll help them with their matter. But if they got the evidence, great, it makes it easier for me. The problem is if the abuser has if they have resources, if they have assets, if they have the ability to hire their own lawyer, that lawyer could try to disprove my evidence by responding to the protective order, for example. So it's always good that you have evidence of physical violence. You can I've had success in the courtroom based off of just testimony alone, but it is riskier, because the problem is if victim is saying something happened, but the abuser is saying no, it didn't happen, then the judge could be stuck, and the judge would have to be very difficult for the judge to make an accurate decision. So that's why evidence is so important. The other type of face of violence that I want to talk about is the sexual violence. Again, that is a lot more objective and easier to prove than some of the more emotional areas of power and control, like for example, emotional abuse or intimidation, but where maybe an abuser makes the victim afraid by using looks or actions or certain gestures. That's a little bit harder to prove, and there's a strong chance it's not going to rise to the level of what I need to be able to prove in the courtroom. So, but the sexual violence, if you have some evidence, you've gone to the police, you've gone to the hospital, there's medical records out there, things that I can subpoena, or if you, because time is of the essence, I might ask the victim to go get me their medical records, because that way I don't have to, subpoena could take a little bit longer, and time is of the essence, especially if we have a court hearing coming up. So, anyways, but that gets into the little technical details of how I help the victim, and that's not what I want to talk about. I don't want to go into the nuts and bolts too deeply for purposes of this video, because that's my job. The purpose of today's video is to help you identify these 10 different faces. So we agree, physical violence, sexual violence, more objective, more easier to prove. It's a little bit more black and white. And I don't think you need a lawyer to talk for 30 minutes about how something provable and objective is great evidence. I don't think I need to waste your time on that. What I want to do right now is I want to talk about the other 8 faces of an abuser. I want to start off with intimidation. Intimidation by itself might not rise to the level of being able to prove violence has happened and it's likely to happen again in the future, that by itself. So I might want to look at some other surrounding evidence, and we'll get into that in a minute. But let's talk about intimidation specifically. What is intimidation? But I do want to tell you that intimidation is a type of face or a mask that an abuser will wear to in order to have power and control over the victim. So what could an abuser do to show that they are intimidating a victim? Let's think about it. Intimidation. I would say it's when you make the victim afraid by maybe using looks, action, certain things you do, like smashing things, gestures, maybe making the victim think that you're going to do some type of physical harm to their body, to their person. Another way to intimidate a victim would be to smash their things, like break their cell phone, smash their laptop, tearing the mirrors, side view mirrors off their car. I mean, there's so many ways to smash things. It's destroying property. Again, that kind of goes back to maybe going on a rampage around the house or the apartment and just destroying their property, things they need for work, for example, that the victim needs to be successful at work, and you're destroying that property they need. Another way, and I've seen this sadly, abusing pets. Dogs tend to get abused in violent households. Sometimes the family dog might get killed. It's a way to intimidate the victim. It's abusing pets is a way to hurt the victim. Now there are laws against cruelty to animals, but we're going to get into that. And if the victim has had PTSD from other things, and that animal is considered like an emotional support or a therapy animal or some type of service animal, then harming that animal, there's more penalties for that. But again, that starts getting into the criminal code, and I'm really just sticking to the Texas Family Code here. So abusing pets, definitely. Another big one, and I made another video about this a couple years ago, displaying weapons. And that's a big one for me. And I really take issue with this. I mean, guys, this is Texas. We have a lot of guns in the state. A lot of people own firearms. The thing is, a lot of people don't actually use their firearms. They don't even know how to use them. They don't even know how to load them. They don't even know how to charge the weapon. They don't know how to clear the weapon. They don't know how to point the weapon. And yet they have. So we all have, a lot of us have weapons, but they're not really used that often. A lot of them just, we buy a weapon for protection, and in reality, it just sits in a box in the closet, or hopefully somewhere safe where children can't get it, or hopefully in a safe. But we have these weapons, and we never use them. But then suddenly, it's like the relationship between the victim and the abuser takes a turn. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, the abuser decides to start displaying their weapon. I'm not saying they're pointing the weapon at the victim, but come on, guys. Maybe they've been married for 20, 30, 40 years, and that weapon has never come outside the box. And then suddenly, during the divorce process, for example, the abuser decides, you know what, I'm gonna start cleaning the weapon. You know, I take issue with that. And I've done this many times in a protective order hearing, when I'm questioning the victim or the abuser while they're on the witness stand. I dig into this this BS where the abuser thinks that they can start wearing the wearing the sidearm. They've never done it before. Now suddenly they're wearing the sidearm around the house. They're displaying their weapons in the house. They're not really necessarily pointing it at the victim, because remember, pointing it at the victim, you know, now we start getting into aggravated assault and all that stuff, and that's more objective. The purpose of this video is to operate within the nuances, the penumbras of a narcissist, because they're slick. They know what they're doing. And I'm here to call them out. So an example would be a narcissist decides to, after many years of never using their weapons, they decide to start cleaning the weapons on the kitchen table. To me, that is considered displaying a firearm. And I do call abusers out, and when I am at a hearing, a protective order hearing, I have to prove to the judge that, you know, there's a likelihood of family violence happening in the future. And yeah, if those weapons are being displayed, I will make an issue out of it. And I really don't care if it was never pointed at the victim. Remember, I'm here to protect the victim. And we all know it's BS that those weapons never saw the light of day, but then suddenly there's issues in the relationship and those weapons mysteriously start coming out of the box. Okay, we know it's BS. And I've also made lots of videos about murder-suicides. I made a video maybe a year ago about a horrific murder-suicide in the Houston area. Another one about something kind of similar that happened in Dallas. Also, sadly, here in the Houston area, I don't want to go too much into detail, but there was a recent murder-suicide at during a child custody exchange. The baby was just barely a few weeks old. The parents weren't getting along for whatever reason. So I guess the baby daddy shot the mother in front of the child, and now that child is going to grow up without a parent. And also that child is going to grow up without either parent, because the father, after he murdered the mom, went a few blocks away and then shot himself. Murder-suicide. So, just a pro tip, if any abusers are listening to this, I mean, come on guys, if you're going to if you're the kind of guy who does something stupid, get rid of those weapons, please. It's really just a liability more than anything else. And if I get a protective order, you can say goodbye to your weapons for life. Well, most likely for life, because I will be asking for a lifetime protective order. And yeah, and you know what? That Second Amendment argument doesn't work. Doesn't work. Okay, so that's the intimidation part. Now, the next face of an abuser that I want to talk about is emotional abuse. And this is the most common form of abuse. I'll to give you a little pro tip about this. You might watch a lot of other videos on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or whatever about abusers. It always seems like the videos about narcissists and emotional abusers always go to the top, because that's where all the clicks are, because that's where all the activity is. Emotional abuse is actually extremely common, unfortunately. But if I were to make a video about male privilege, treating the victim like a servant, acting like the master of the castle, all that stuff. Or if I were to make a video about the Texas rules of appellate procedure and how to be successful on appeal, yeah, you know what, I'm probably going to get 20 views. I might, 23 views on a good day, because that's not where that's not what people are focusing on. They're in the heat of the moment, they're very emotional, and they seem to gravitate towards videos about emotional abuse, where I could easily get, tens of thousands of views in a very short amount of time. And if my videos try to meet a certain, I try to actually follow the YouTube recommendations on how to make a short and all this stuff, I could really get it up there. I really could if I wanted to, but I don't really want to do these really short videos, because that's only for YouTubers who are really out for the clicks. That's not who I am. I'm here to protect people in my area, which is the Houston area. So if I have to go a little bit longer, then I'll go a little bit longer. But emotional abuse, this is the number one area when I talk about abusers, what abusers want, which is power and control over the victim, and one of the most easiest ways to do it is through emotional abuse. So let's talk about emotional abuse. What is it? Okay, if somebody came to me and they are just over it, they're done with being abused and subjected to all this bullying, I might ask some questions. I might ask them, well, has the abuser ever put you down? Has the abuser ever made you feel bad about yourself or called you names? Another thing I might look for is, are they playing mind games with the victim or trying to make the victim think they're crazy, like crazy making behavior? Other things you can do to make a victim feel bad or to emotionally abuse a victim is to, humiliate them and do what you can to make them feel guilty. And there's lots of ways to make somebody feel guilty. You can make them feel guilty about the children and all this stuff, but that falls under another category, which I'll be getting into shortly. But emotional abuse is definitely the top one, and it's extremely hurtful. And that's where I seem to get most of the activity. Unfortunately, for purposes of like a restraining order or a protective order, emotional abuse by itself doesn't always rise to the level of what the judge is looking for when they decide to grant some type of order that would give the victim the relief that they need. But the judge is a good family law judge is mindful and will hopefully they'll look at everything. And I know the judge will, under the rules of evidence, the judge is only allowed to, quote unquote, look at certain exhibits, but not at others, because the judge is trying to arrive at an accurate decision based off of the rules of evidence and the rules of civil procedure, I guess, to prevent the decision from being remanded or reversed on appeal. So the judge has to, for legal reasons, the judge is only allowed to look at certain things. But I would pray that a good judge who knows what they're doing and who is actually, empathetic and mindful would, kind of in their subconscious would actually take more of a global look at the entire picture, and hopefully let that be, I'm not going to say a judge will look at things outside the scope of the pleadings or the admissible evidence, but in a real world where victims really are vulnerable and could get, killed by an abuser, I think it's important for the judge to be mindful about the entire situation. And I'm not hinting that they should only look at things beyond the scope of what they're allowed to, but I do ask that and hope that they do at least take a mindful approach and an empathetic approach to the entire situation, and acknowledge that if they make a bad decision, it could have serious consequences for the victim. Okay, so that is the emotional abuse. Now, so we talked about the intimidation, emotional abuse. Another type, a face of an abuser be isolation. And I'm going to go ahead and say it. This Houston area is a very international area. I have clients from every single continent except Antarctica. But I do have clients from everywhere, and a lot of them are, sometimes the victims can be a little, ESL, their English is their second language. They're not really familiar with our American system, our values. Maybe there's some cultural differences in certain countries. I'm not going to mention which countries, but, a woman has a duty to, have sex with her husband, whereas that duty doesn't exist in the United States. But it really, maybe in other countries, it can really create a very dark universe for the victim, where it's expected that they subject themselves to the power and control of the abuser. I'm not going to name countries, but I will. You can Google countries that are patriarchal, very kind of male-based, very listen to the male figure, and that's what goes. They don't need the court system. They don't need family law judges to make decisions for their family. It's just patriarchal. And those clients who come from those kind of backgrounds, that's where I see a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of trauma, and I have to tell them that, well, I'm sorry things happen like that back in your home country, but we do have protections here in the United States. And I'm not going to try to say the United States is better or worse than other countries. I mean, we're doing the best we can with the laws that we have, and we're doing what we can to protect victims. But let's get back to the intimidation thing, or correction, isolation. Okay, so how do you isolate a victim? So if somebody comes to me and that maybe they don't even realize they're isolated, but after I talk to them and do a consultation and get a clearer picture of what's going on, I can actually tell them, like, ma'am, I think you're being isolated by your spouse because they're holding your passport, holding your papers. They control what you do. They control who you're allowed to see, who you are allowed to talk to. If you dare talk to another man, well, there's going to be you're going to answer to a jealous abuser very soon afterwards. But not in public, because the abuser doesn't want to abuse you in public, because that would expose themselves to the world. So they'll just be abusive behind closed doors. But let's talk about the isolation. So control what the victim does, what the victim sees, who they talk to, hell, even what they read, and definitely where they go. The abuser would definitely want to limit the victim's outside involvement. Also, the victim would be subjected to jealous behaviors from the abuser. So the abuser might want to use jealousy to justify their actions. For example, remember, the abuser doesn't want the victim they want to limit their outside involvement. They want to control who they see, who they talk to, where they go. So if the victim dares be seen talking to another man, then the victim's going to have to answer to a jealous abuser. And that abuser is going to use jealousy to justify their illegal actions. I'll tell you a quick story about something that happened 20 years ago. Gosh, I'm old. When I went to Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas, gig 'em, class of 05. I worked at a restaurant on Northgate. It was a summer job. I was during the fall and spring semester, I was in the Corps Cadets. I'm not going to mention the restaurant. But I did work at a restaurant on Northgate. Cool place to work. I was a young man. I was single. All the other employees were young and single. I would like to say I was well known or liked. And I wasn't a mean guy. I wasn't aggressive. I wasn't pushy. I was just a normal college student living in College Station, Texas. Trying to save up some money. And there was this new employee, a female employee. She came to work at the restaurant. And, we all got to say hi. She was nice. She very friendly towards me. So, being a young man, I called her and asked her, hey, you want to go out, you know, like to the movies? I don't know, there's probably something dumb in the theaters. It was probably Austin Powers was out or something, I don't know. But I just wanted to, you know, be friendly and ask somebody out on a date, no big deal. And I wasn't being pushy or anything, just very friendly and very shy. Very politely, she said no. And then the next day, she didn't come to work. And I was like, hey, where's so-and-so? And all the other coworkers were saying, oh, no, Chris, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's like, whoa, what happened? And they're like, oh, you don't know? I'm like, no, what happened? This is freaking me out because, you know, asked her out last night, no big deal. She politely said no, so I respect that, no big deal. And then suddenly she's not at work and everyone's saying, it's not your fault, Chris, it's not your fault. So one of the coworkers said, I'll tell you what happened after work. So I was like, okay. So after work, she came up to me and she said, okay, what happened was you called her last night and her boyfriend was in the apartment. And he kind of heard the conversation. Well, he forced her to tell her what happened, that I've got this other guy who's asking her out, and he took that as a threat. He got this was complete isolation. Anyways, he beat her. It was very unfortunate. It wasn't my fault. I had nothing wrong, and nobody said I had done anything wrong. But I had just, you know, one human being talking to another human, and that's all it took for the abuser to beat the snot out of her. And she never came back to work. I hope she got some kind of protective order, but wow. So, you know, and all I can say is, you know, I can just keep doing my best to be as mindful as possible, but I can't, you know, anticipate every possible consequence to every innocent action. So that was really sad, really disappointing, and something I'll never forget. But yeah, definitely an example of someone who was probably at home in her apartment with her abusive boyfriend. He's probably making her feel guilty about how she sits on her ass all day or something and tells her to go get a job. So she goes out and gets a job and interacts with other human beings, and that is just too much for the abuser to tolerate. Everything is a threat and needs to shut that down. Immediately uses jealousy to limit her outside involvement and makes the big mistake of beating her. So hopefully she got away from that guy. But that's an example of isolation. And also I would argue that he was also preventing her from getting or keeping a job, which would fall under economic abuse, which is another face of an abuser, which I'm going to get into later. But yeah, all of these these faces of an abuser that I'm going through, a lot of them overlap with each other. A lot of overlappage. Some of these faces can be a little bit more independent of the other, but all need to be considered. Okay, so the other face of an abuser that I want to go into is minimizing, denying, and blaming. And anybody who's been in an abusive relationship, or any former narcissists out there who are watching this video, we would have to acknowledge that is something abusers do. They minimize, deny, and blame. Example of minimizing a victim would be making light of the abuse, saying it's not that big of a deal, or like maybe the abuser did something really crappy to the victim, whether it's physical violence, sexual violence, or one of these more emotional psychological things that doesn't always really rise to the level of family violence, but they make light of the abuse, saying it's not that big of a deal. Or Sometimes, and this kind of goes back to emotional abuse, but it still falls under minimizing, denying, and blaming, is then they deny the abuse. They say the abuse never happened, which also kind of goes into emotional abuse, which is crazy making behavior, because you're making the victim doubt themselves, doubt their position, or doubt what happened, or their oh my gosh, I have never as a domestic violence lawyer, and I'm not laughing because I'm making light of anything. It's just so ridiculous that sometimes the abuser will tell the victim that they're lying, and they'll declare in the courtroom that the victim's lying, and it just never ends. So minimizing and denying, saying the abuse didn't happen. Or the other category would be blaming. That's shifting responsibility for the abusive behavior and saying that the victim somehow caused it. Now, okay. Blaming a victim, saying they were the ones who were responsible and they caused the abusive behavior. Okay. It's not appropriate to victim shame or blame the victim. It's not appropriate at all. But as somebody who's seen a lot, I do have an appreciation for the circumstantial complexity of what I do, and I understand people are going through economic hardships. People have their own issues, their own baggage from their own past relationships, their own trauma, a lot of circumstantial complexity. But for purposes of having power and control over a victim, it is inappropriate to shift responsibility for the abusive behavior and say that they caused it for purposes of having power and control over the victim. Now, if the abuser truly believes, or they're not an abuser, or if there's room for healing, then you guys need to go out and get some couples therapy and try that out. But if it doesn't work out, then you need to reconsider your boundaries with this person. I'm not encouraging anyone to break up or get divorced. I do protect victims, but whether somebody breaks up, separates, becomes estranged, divorces, whatever, that's a very personal decision, and I'm not pushy. I'm not pushy about that. Sometimes when I'm dealing with a victim who's been through a lot of trauma, sometimes they just need somebody to kind of take charge a little bit and kind of tell them, okay, this is the direction I really want you to go. But at the end of the day, it's their decision how if they want to move forward. Now, on the criminal side, the prosecutor can step inside the shoes of the victim, tell the victim to step aside and go after the abuser, but that's a little bit different. That's not what I do. I'm a family law attorney. Okay, so that was minimizing, denying, and blaming. The other big area I want to talk about is when the other face of an abuser is someone who will use the children to hurt the victim. So an abuser and a victim, they have kids together, okay? Things don't work out or are currently not working out, and they want to use the children to make the victim feel guilty. Lots of ways to do that. Example might be to make someone feel guilty about the children is the victim decides they need to stay in an abusive relationship because it's best for the children. I'm an Army veteran, and I was in the Army during the global war on terror. Oh my God, 1 year in Iraq, I hear so many stories from my fellow soldiers about what's going on at home, what the wife is doing or the husband's doing back home. It's very, very unfortunate, and a lot of room to use children. One soldier committed suicide, his wife had, I guess, you know, I have empathy towards Army wives. You know, they go through hell. There are a lot of dread. They have their own PTSD. I'm very empathetic about that, very mindful. It's a lot of complexity there. But when the spouse back home has the kids and the service members overseas, there's a lot of room to torture the service member while they're overseas, make them feel guilty about the children. And also, it's not just that situation, it's also reversed, and it's not just the military. There's lots of ways to make somebody feel guilty. Another way to use children is using children to relay messages. It's not appropriate, but I mean, when there's child custody exchanges, sometimes and the child is old enough to kind of know what's going on. Sometimes it might be easier to just relay messages through the children, like, hey, tell your mom you've got a soccer game on this date. I need you at my house, or so and so just died. There's going to be a funeral. Tell mom you need to go to this funeral. And now the other parent feels guilty because they're not making the child available to the other parent so they can go to this important, you know, family obligation. So you really, when it comes to co-parenting, the parents really need to learn how to communicate and effectively. And sometimes communication is just broken down. So we have these co-parenting apps. The big one is called Our Family Wizard. The other one is called App Close. I think there's another one, a big one called Talking Parents. It's a way for the parents to communicate through an app, which theoretically supposed to remove the emotion from the equation, so they can just co-parent and focus on talking about custody exchange, medical, dental, educational decisions, all these things. But unfortunately, they don't always use the app like they're supposed to, and they go back to texting or just screaming at each other, and then need to go back and start paying money to the lawyers. So using children, also you maybe using visitation to harass the other parent. Did I not tell you earlier in this video about a custody exchange that turned into a murder-suicide? So it was very scary and unfortunate, where I guess things got a little too heated at the custody exchange, and one of the parents ended up murdering the other parent, and then they turned the gun on themselves. So now we got this poor child who's going to grow up without any parents because they were not able to co-parent. Very sad, very unfortunate. But that's an extreme example of using visitation as an opportunity to have some type of power and control over the victim. So so that's using children. And the last thing I want to talk about under using children is maybe making threats to take the children away. That happens. Unfortunately, it really, amongst the more poor Houstonians in this area, they just don't have the money to hire an expensive lawyer, and then the other parent just comes and takes the kid and accuses them of abuse or makes false reports to CPS. Unfortunately, it happens a lot, and it's very unfortunate, and they just don't have the money to really fight a long, expensive case, especially when they're dealing with an ex who's willing to lie about them. It's very, very unfortunate, very heartbreaking, and it's even frustrating for me. But even I have to, at some level, I have to separate myself emotionally and kind of be mentally disciplined when I'm helping victims, because I don't want to get too, I want to empathize, I want to walk around in their shoes, I want to feel their pain, but I do have to keep that professional barrier and not allow my own opinions or emotions to take control. Okay, so that was the other face of an abuser. Now I want to talk about another face, which is economic abuse. How can an abuser have power and control over a victim economically? It sounds like the dumbest question in the world, because we all know what you do is you prevent them from getting or keeping a job. You threaten to call their employer and get them fired. Or if the victim really makes the abuser mad, the abuser will call the corporate office and say all these bad things about the victim. It's happened. Many cases, unfortunately. So preventing the victim from getting or keeping a job. So, and let me refer back to my College Station story about the poor girl who was a new hire at the restaurant and was immediately beaten by her boyfriend like the next day. He was isolating her. So preventing the victim from getting or keeping a job. Another way to control a victim is to put them on an allowance, or take their income, or not let them know about or have access to the family income. And unfortunately, this happens a lot. I do see it more, I don't know the word, intensely. It was more intense examples in the immigrant community, where you might bring somebody over here from a foreign country, take their papers, tell them to go get a job, and then you take their money. It's literally slavery. And we do have the 13th Amendment that's supposed to abolish slavery, but unfortunately it doesn't always do the trick. But also this whole economic abuse thing, you can also kind of start getting into really dangerous areas like human trafficking, when you bring somebody over here from another country and you make them work. Now, I'm not just talking about sex workers, but that does happen too. And we start really going into, depending on the facts, but that's not what this video is for. And I have seen some very disturbing things, but for purposes of economic abuse, prevent the victim from getting or keeping a job, making them ask for money or not giving it to them at all, putting them on an allowance, taking their money, taking their papers, and not letting them know about or have access to family income. It happens, and it's very sad. That is just another of the many faces an abuser might have. Okay, that was economic abuse. Now let's talk about another face of an abuser, which would be male privilege. Male privilege. Maybe an abuser treats the victim like they're a servant. The abuser makes all the big decisions. I see this, and I see this, it's really so inappropriate, but I see it it's very subtle. I see examples where maybe a victim has like their own separate property. A separate property under Texas Family Code is defined as something somebody has before marriage or acquired by gift or inheritance during the marriage. So it's separate property versus community property, which is assets acquired during the marriage. So maybe a victim has their separate property, but the abuser really steps in and tells them, no, this is what you're going to do with it. No, this is a big waste of time. You need to get rid of it. We don't like it.
Thank you.
That would be an example of in my opinion of male privilege, telling a victim what to do when they legally have no voice or no say in that matter, but they try to exercise their male privilege anyways. It's very, very inappropriate, and I do see it. I do see it in the domestic violence situations, but I also see it just in daily life. So another way for an abuser to exercise male privilege, other than making all the big decisions and treating the victim like a servant, an example might be they're acting like the master of the castle. That's a big one. And let's see, how else might an abuser exercise male privilege? Oh, they are being the ones to define gender roles in the house. Example might be the male doesn't want the female to get a job. They want them to stay home, cook, have food on the table, take care of the kids, and they go off and they're the only ones allowed to earn money. I see that, and it causes a lot of frustrations, a lot of tensions, a lot of heartache, and can turn into a lot of I call it uneven power in a relationship. And now we have the situation where I have a stay-at-home mom who is just over the abuse. They're done with it, and they want a divorce. But the problem is they're going against an abuser who has assets. They have income, and they can hire a great lawyer to try to shut me down. And of course, I'm no disrespect to the opposing counsel, but I'm probably better than him. But it's still uphill battle, especially if the abuser decides to financially cut off the victim during the marriage. You're not supposed to do that. We have things called temporary orders or mutual injunctions. You're not supposed to do that. But if the victim is just really has no assets, and it's hard for them to pay their lawyer, and it's hard for the lawyer to even get a hearing to ask for attorney fees to be paid during the pendency of the divorce, then it's just a bad situation altogether for the stay-at-home parent who has less power than the abuser, economic power, but also other types of powers. So that's really male privilege. Okay. The last big one I want to talk about is coercion and threats. How can you have power and control over a victim by coercing them and making threats? Let's think about this. Maybe the abuser is making and or carrying out threats to do something to hurt the victim. Maybe the abuser is making threats to leave the victim, to cut them off. Unfortunately, this happens a lot. They threaten suicide. And I do tell victims come to me and they're very nervous about moving forward with the divorce or the protective order or the custody matter or whatever, because they're afraid their abuser is going to commit suicide. Well, you know what? I'm just going to say this. I'm just going to be straight. Staying in an abusive relationship because you're afraid that if you leave the abusive relationship, then the abuser is going to abuse themselves and commit self-harm. That is just a toxic pickle to be in. You just need to get out, and if they commit suicide, that's unfortunate, but that was their issue, not yours. And yes, without going into numbers, I am a domestic violence lawyer in Houston, and there's a lot of issues in the city, and yes, the suicides have happened, and it's unfortunate, but I can't have a situation where the victim is just going to stay in a situation where they're subjected to power and control by the abuser, and the reason they need to stay in this abusive relationship is because the abuser is going to kill themselves if they dare leave. That is just an abusive, emotionally abusive situation to be in, filled with so many layers of coercion and threats. It's so inappropriate. You just need to leave the abuser. And if they do something bad, I'm sorry, that's unfortunate, but you know what? It is what it is. So, threatening self-harm. So let's see here. We talked about threatening to leave her, commit suicide. Oh, big one. And it never works. They're reporting her to welfare. Go call the Social Security office. They don't care, but they do it all the time. They'll report their baby mama to welfare because, I don't know, in their mind, they think the victim's cheating the welfare system or something, or maybe they're not. They're just going to lie to the Social Security office to have their benefits turned off. I follow what other lawyers are saying all the time. I have never overheard a situation where someone is successful at having someone's welfare benefits cut off. And by the way, even if you were, I don't even know how to, I guess you can call the Social Security office, report fraud, but good luck, because that hotline is probably getting 10 billion phone calls a day anyway, so it's just not going to work, so give it up. But yeah, reporting them to welfare, great way to control them. Very unfortunate. Another way for an abuser to use coercion and threats is by, let's see here, making the victim do illegal things. Sometimes maybe a victim subjected to power and control of their abuser, and the abuser forces the victim to get involved in these little scams, illegal, or even larger, greater illegal activity, like some type of organized crime. Or I've seen situations where a female might lure a victim somewhere for sex, and lure them into a hotel room, and then that's when the boyfriend jumps out and robs that person. So that might be an example where the person who did the luring, they too were a victim, because it was actually the boyfriend was trying to get the victim to lure an unsuspecting victim to a hotel room where that person would get robbed or something. So making them do illegal things. And the other big one is making the victim drop charges. Victims recant all the time. And one of my big frustrations as a domestic violence lawyer is when victims go back to the abuser. Sometimes victim will be intimidated in different ways, and the abuser is trying to get the victim to kind of drop the protective order, or we call it vacating the protective order. It's not going to happen. But sometimes, rare situations, when you're dealing with family violence, sometimes the victim, they realize that they don't want the protective order. It was, they asked for something, but they didn't really know what they were asking for. They asked for it out of emotion. And then getting the protective order, and then they realize, oh my gosh, this is not what I wanted. And then they go back to a lawyer and ask to vacate the protective order. That happens sometimes. Everything's very case by case. But when somebody comes to me because they don't want to move forward anymore, I just want to make sure I have a serious talk with them and say, okay, are we dropping this because it's truly what you want to do, or are you being coerced? Another thing is maybe you're getting buttered up and they're going to just take advantage of you to get you to dismiss the case, or go talk to the prosecutor or talk to the police and recant everything. And then once that's taken care of, then the abuser will go back to the victim and start harassing them all over again. It's just like this abuse cycle they can never get out of. The only way for the victim to really be successful is they have to stop this cycle of power and control and say, no, I'm not going to be part of it anymore. I'm not going to be subjected to that. I'm done with this abuser. Okay, so I talked about the first face of an abuser that I talked about was the type of abuser who uses the legal system to harass the victim. Sometimes those cases can get dismissed, those cases can get abated, or go all the way to final judgment and let the judge just make a decision. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes using the legal system. I do my best. I've had a number of victims who are being harassed through the legal system, and I do my best to protect them. But for an abuser, it's not, on its face, it's not I guess, illegal to exercise your legal rights, but I want to, when they do that, I want to look at what is the purpose of this frivolous lawsuit. Is it really just to harass them, or are you filing this lawsuit in good faith? It's a good question to ask. And I want to, if I have to go in front of the judge, I want to make sure the judge knows that this is completely frivolous. They're just doing this to harass us or extort the victim, intimidate them, whatever, because they can't, they don't have any other way to have power and control over the victim. So that was the first one I talked about. Physical violence, sexual violence, not really for this video because those are a little bit more objective and easier to prove. So I want to kind of really go into the areas that are a little bit more gray, like the emotional abuse, the intimidation, using children. And again, not just because you heard something in my video doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically have a winning case, but I do want it to shed light on a greater issue, which is power and control. Remember, at the beginning of this video, I said I want to talk about the different faces of an abuser and then talk about what is the one common thing that they always have in common. And that is a desire for power and control, whether it's male privilege, coercion and threats, intimidation, sexual violence, physical violence, minimizing the victim, denying the abuse happened, or shifting responsibility for the abusive behavior. It's all about having power and control. Okay, so we get to the power and control. All right, so I have an abuser, or I want them. I'm about to get my protective order, protect the victim. The abuser is freaking out because their power and control I've already removed it. We haven't even gone to court yet. Or maybe we're going to go to court and I'm going to remove it, remove their power and control. But in my experience, what is it that's underneath, beyond the power and control? Why do they want power and control? When I take an abuser and I remove their power and control, what is underneath? What remains? I'll tell you what I see. And I'm not a psychologist, but I do see this. I see anxiety. I see fear. Untreated mental health issues like maybe bipolar disorder. And I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not diagnosing anything. But this is what I think. It's a lot of it also has to do with impulse control. Maybe an abuser, they were harmed themselves as a child. They were in an unsafe environment growing up. And I'm not making excuses for abusive behavior because we're all adults here and we all need to take ownership of our actions as adults. But I do think that these things that the abuser experienced, whether maybe they grew up themselves in an unsafe environment, an unstable environment. Maybe they grew up in a violent environment. Their parents weren't there. Their parents neglected them. Parents were on a mental vacation growing up. They didn't have all the resources and things available to them, and it created maybe a great sadness. Or another example, and this is more of a specific example. Sometimes the abuser themselves, they were bullied when they were younger, or they were always called a fag, or always being called gay, or always, being teased. So they want to kind of compensate for that as adults and prove that they're not gay or something, and they want to prove that by having power and control over a female, to prove that they are manly. In their mind, this is what a man is. Very inappropriate, very sad. A lot of psychological issues going on. One thing I notice about abusers in power and control is an abuser, in my opinion, is oftentimes a narcissist. And what is a narcissist? A narcissist is somebody who, in my opinion, is not capable of feeling or seeing someone else's pain. They're not able to walk around in that person's shoes. They're not able to be present in the moment and judge be able to look at a situation without judgment. Maybe they are too hyper focused on their past regrets or their future anxieties. That's where they are, but one place they're not is in the present. Okay, so what is someone who's not an abuser? Purpose of this video, I'm going to say either a victim or an empath. And sometimes a victim and an empath can overlap. Sometimes they're independent of each other. Everything is so fact specific. But what is an empath? An empath is someone who is empathetic, who is able to see someone else's pain, able to experience and feel that pain, able to understand and visualize what they're going through. They're able to not focus so much on their past regrets and their future anxieties, but rather focus on the present moment without judgment, and be able to listen without judgment. That is an empath. And an abuser will never be able to have that experience. And also, empathy is not something we're born with. It is a learned behavior. We have to learn and spread awareness about power and control and what abusers do and who they are. And also, at the same time, instead of just pointing the finger at abusers, we also have to take a look at ourselves and be like, how can we get on this path towards empathy, towards getting away and letting go of any desire for power and control? Because remember, the victim might be a child, and they grow up in this environment. So it doesn't always have to be mom and dad or husband and wife, partners, adult partners. Sometimes the abuser is a parent and abusing a child, and the child is a victim. But because that child grew up in an unsafe, unstable, and in a violent environment, and nobody ever had that child's back or acted in the child's best interest, that child did not have things available to them, and they were just spit on and ridiculed, then maybe that child will grow up to be an abuser too. And that's very unfortunate. And that's why I say we need to break these cycles. We have to be able to know how to look at things through a power and control lens. And then suddenly we'll be able to see things more clearly. And hopefully be able to take one step closer to a world where domestic violence is not tolerated. Anyways, I want to thank you for joining me on this long hike through Sugarland Memorial Park. I'm probably going to need my GPS to find my way out of the woods, but it was a really good time, and I really enjoyed talking to you and I hope you get something out of this video. Please go to my website. Go to the top right of my website, chrismarlawfirm.com. I'll leave a link down in the comments. But go to my website. On the top right, you see articles, videos, and podcasts. Go in there and type in power and control wheel. You see this really cool PDF on one of my web articles you can click on. It's called the power and control wheel, also known as the Duluth model, which is a training model used in domestic violence centers to train workers on what domestic violence is, what to look for, and it's also a great way to kind of open the eyes of the victim and let them be able to make sense of the chaos. Because if a victim's just been subjected to trauma for so many years and they're just carrying this horrible burden with them their whole life, and they're just stuck in these little mental doom loops, like this infinite tape playing in their head, like you're a bad person, you're a bad person, you're a bad person. It's these I guess trauma cycles. They're stuck in it because they don't know, they don't really have a name for this. And once they see the power and control wheel, things start snapping into place very quickly. And they are like, wow, things are starting to make sense now. Why that person did that to me. It was always about power and control. They never actually loved me. They were just using me. So it's a valuable model, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Please do. It's on my website. You can also private message me if you have any questions. I'm not your lawyer unless you retain me, and you pay me a retainer. We sign a representation agreement, so there is no attorney-client relationship. And I do have a disclaimer at the bottom of my website that it's not legal advice unless we have a representation agreement in place. But I do care about my clients. I only represent victims. I don't help abusers. I don't want to, I don't need to. And it's very rewarding, and I'm able to sleep at night knowing that I'm doing my small part to make the world a safer place. But anyways, thank you, and please consider subscribing.